I always have been someone who's like, okay, this is the way we currently do it. How can we do it better?
People don't understand that like the hospital has a lot of options and a finite amount of time and a finite amount of resources to do anything, right? That is like new products, new solutions, new services, whatever.
Once we can teach innovators to speak the language of the hospital and the language of the healthcare system, it's only going to benefit them.
These innovators get obsessed with the idea more so than like how that idea is implemented, or if that idea in its current form is the best solution to actually make an impact.
Hey, if you can learn a little bit more and just pivot ever so slightly from that clinical mind to like, how does this translate industry? How fun would that be? How impactful would that be?
A lot of startups will lead with ROI when they're pitching to like a hospital or health system.
Value is so much more than just ROI.
From the people that work in the hospital, right? It seems like they're all working in the business, and there's very few people that are working on the business.
I think that there's a huge, huge space for integration of
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of the Medtech Innovation Podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Jones, founder at Exo Medtech. Not enough people talk about where the rubber really meets the road in medtech innovation and kind of healthcare technology innovation. So many people talk about the solution and the technology and all this amazing stuff that it can do, but there's really not enough discussion about how it gets implemented, how it gets rolled out, the adoption strategy, the implementation strategy, how things are impacting the hospital just from like a workflow and process perspective, and like how the clinician workflow is accounted for when you have something that's really new and awesome and innovative, right, on the med tech or health tech side, and you're wanting to get that into a hospital. So that is what we dig into in this episode. You're absolutely going to love it. We have Natalie Freels. She's a physician's assistant, also the CEO of InsightHealth Consulting. She's a PA, researcher, educator. She works in internal medicine at Mayo Clinic, and just like a whole host of knowledge. She's very passionate about electronic health record optimization, wearable medical devices, and espresso, and her kids, oddly enough too. But this episode is jam-packed. We talk about EHRs, how they can be better. We talk about protected time and giving physicians and clinicians allotted time so they can really think innovatively, work on the business instead of just working in the business, which is something you hear business leaders talk about a lot, but there's not enough time that clinicians, right, and surgeons are given to work kind of on the business themselves. We talk about that. We talk about kind of the value analysis committee and like value beyond just the economic ROI and like good implementation strategies, like what's getting lost in translation between these innovators and then the hospitals that are trying to adopt this stuff, how to win, how to do it the right way, how to do it the wrong way. So I know you're going to love this episode. If you are anyone that has to, at any point during your journey, get something used in a hospital, get it evaluated, piloted, implemented, integrated, and do all of that successfully, you're going to love this episode. And so without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump in. Natalie, welcome to the pod. So excited to have you. Where do we find you today?
Hey, Spencer. So happy to be here. I am here in sunny Jacksonville in my home office.
Awesome. Yeah, I am also in the home office. I think I said this before, but I truly believe like A players work better at home and B players are like way worse at home. But
yes.
You're an A player. That's why we have you here on the pod today. And like we had a couple of conversations in the past, honestly, like loved what you were doing and like really want to get you on the pod. I know you're going to have like a ton of like awesome insights and perspectives. And of course, I always love hearing about clinicians that got bit by the innovation bug. So we'll maybe start there. That's kind of the first question is, would love if you could introduce yourself a little bit, kind of talk about your journey kind of into, the clinical side of things, and then what got you bit by the innovation bug and how'd you bridge that gap into medtech innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Natalie Freels. I am a physician assistant by trade and clinical background. Right now, I practice in hospital internal medicine, which means general hospitalized patients, anyone 18 and up gets admitted to our service. We see a whole wide variety of different diseases, chronic and acute, post-surgical, pre-op, post-op, the whole gamut. It's absolutely a fantastic field of medicine to be in. Number one, because you can accomplish so much in one hospitalization. Some people disagree, but I think that one hospitalization can be really impactful to someone's life and to their health long-term. And number two, you really get to see so many different facets of medicine really get to learn from some of the best. And I've been really blessed to be able to do that. But absolutely, I was hit by the innovation bug. Man, I think like as a kid, honestly, I'm a tinkerer. My dad is like this man who can probably fix anything. And so I grew up fixing washing machines and putting up drywall and solving these problems. And I think for like my 10th birthday, he got me one of those like those electronic switchboards. Have you seen one of these?
Yeah.
Like if you did a circuits lab in college, you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
What 11-year-old gets that? Like, but we just kind of grew up doing those things, and that need to take a situation and make sure like, is this the best way we can possibly do it, has carried me so far. So whether that was in college or in some of my first jobs in medicine, I always have been someone who's like, okay, this is the way we currently do it. How can we do it better? Sometimes I just do that on my own. Sometimes that's part of a big team. But basically going through that as a professional clinician, bridging that into, I love what I do clinically, and I want to help other people be able to take their ideas and their tech and make it really clinically applicable. And I have found so much fulfillment in that.
That's awesome. It's honestly crazy, the similarities, because I feel like I grew up with like the same dad where we used to call it like, you don't want to have to call the man, which was like, oh, like the washing machine's messing up or the garage door opener or whatever. And you just try to fix it on your own so you don't have to call the man, you know, call the electrician or call the whoever. And so like we still to this day, I like always try to fix things myself. But I also like, I share that like tinkering, you know, thing. People will be like, oh, are you a mechanical engineer? Or are you that? It's like, no, I just like always like to pull things apart, put them back together. My parents back in the day got me a book. It was like How Things Work, because I kept on just asking them like, you know, how does this work? How does this work? And they're like, I don't know. I'm just gonna have to get you this. So no, I think that's like a trait you see a lot with clinician innovators, just like that curiosity and also like the appetite for just like things to be better or like things to work more efficiently. I feel like that's replete throughout the clinical innovators that I've seen. So you talked about trying to help other innovators bring their solutions, their tech, their innovations to life, specifically, you know, around the clinical workflow element too. But tell us about InsightHealth Consulting. Who are kind of the target people, target clients that you work with, and kind of where does your work with them focus?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, you know, I was kind of feeling this a little bit of burnout, honestly, just because when you work within a big health system, there's so many benefits to that. And some of the downside is that, you know, can be a lot of time spent making sure that rolling out something is going to be perfect for our patients. And that's how it should be in a lot of aspects. But there was definitely part of me that was like, man, it would be really interesting to work on some of these projects at like a faster speed. And what does that look like? So I kind of did some soul searching, work with some friends who were in industry, and they said, you know, there's a real need for clinician input. And there's a lot of med tech that doesn't get that, right? Like, and I don't think it comes from a bad place. I think it comes from they want to disrupt healthcare and they really do want to make it better for the most part. I think it does come from a good place. But I got that feedback like, hey, you know, if you can learn a little bit more and just pivot ever so slightly from that clinical mind to like, how does this translate industry? How fun would that be? How impactful would that be? So for me, you know, where I've really found is what something is that I love, or what I've really found that I'm good at is, okay, let's take that original idea that you have, that product that's either still in R&D or we're kind of further down the pipeline, we're doing trials, or maybe we're even to market. But what is that value? Like, what is your elevator pitch? What is that cohesive statement on what this product is? What is the clinical need that it fills, that it serves? Who is it for? And how does it add value to the system? And what I find is like these innovators are genius. They're very smart, but they're almost like too smart for their own good. And when you develop something and it's your baby, sometimes people have a really hard time breaking that down to show other people the value. And I have just loved coming in and being able to take that clinical mind and say, okay, I see that. I get it. You know, from a medical background, that makes sense. The words that we can use to describe it. This is how a nurse might understand it. This is how, you know, your target physician is going to understand it. This is how your administrator is going to understand it. So really to be able to hone in on that value has been really, really crazy fun.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, I see all the time, it feels like these innovators get obsessed with the idea more so than like how that idea is implemented, or if that idea in its current form is the best solution to actually make an impact based on the environment that it's being deployed in, et cetera. And I think they are a little bit resistant to change. Then I feel like sometimes, and I think this is true for clinical innovators, or you're just like, you know, mechanical or biomedical engineering innovators or whoever, where they feel like, well, it's better, so they'll use it and they'll buy it, right? That like clinical applications, clinical clinical workflow piece of it just kind of like doesn't really get ever addressed in their mind because they don't think it's that important because it's better. It's a better mousetrap. Why wouldn't they use it? Why wouldn't they buy it? And there's like a million reasons why they might not, right?
It's X% cheaper. And its value is so much more than just price. Value is so much more than just ROI. And I think that once we get started thinking about, what is that clinical workflow? What are the other elements of value other than, it might be a little better or it might be a little cheaper? There's so much more that goes into that decision-making process. And again, I think it's because a lot of people, they're not in healthcare or they're not in that sector of healthcare, or we all can't practice all types of medicine all over the US or all over the world. We just don't have that experience. And that's why it's so helpful to be able to lean into others who have, they walk the walk and so get their feedback, right? And I think something I see, I don't know, I love to hear from your perspective, is this clinical insight like a one and done, or is this reiterative process? I think the people that get the need for clinical insight, then the next step is understanding that it's not just like a one-time deliverable. Okay, well, I sampled 10 surgeons and this is what they said on my idea. Well, no, then now when you're in R&D and you have a prototype, now you're going back and you're saying, how does this look? How does this work? And you're constantly getting that kind of feedback. But is that something that you've experienced too?
Yeah, people think, a lot of innovators think that like, oh, I'm selling into the hospital, right? And like that in their mind is like one archetype of a customer, right? But I think whether it's regional or, like a hospital in Seattle or a hospital in rural Oklahoma or wherever are going to have like completely different ways of operating. They may be a part of a ACO or an IDN, and they're going to have completely different patient populations, and they may not offer certain services. So their service line mix looks different, and their labor costs might look drastically different, and they may utilize more PAs and less this or more this and less that. Like, so I think like, and all of that impacts not just the clinical workflow, but kind of that like economic workflow or economic value proposition. So I feel like people don't really think about almost like that, like geographical or ethnographic variation between clinical care sites and like within their customer base. And so, I was literally just talking a couple of weeks ago to someone that's on the corporate BD team for like one of the big 15, big 20 companies. And we were talking about a specific technology that we were talking about. And she was like, I don't think they ever really understood the clinical workflow and the clinical use workflow around, this was a nursing focused product, right? When they're going to use it and where they pull it and how many patients are actually getting it and where are those patients getting it within the hospital. And all of that trickles into how do you do sales, how do you do implementation and sales enablement, and like, which again impacts the sales cycle and the revenue cycle. So I think it's a huge under-addressed thing. And to that point, next question here. So like that intersection of clinical practice and kind of innovation strategy, these two worlds oftentimes speak like very different languages like we're talking about. So what are some kind of translation errors that, you see that are causing these different medical or healthcare technologies to fail?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think something I see often is, again, kind of back to that, what is value and what are the metrics that we're using to look at that? I think it's a combination of who you're talking to and what is important to them. And I think that's probably something that gets lost in translation a good deal amount. So what is important to a nurse who's going to use the tech as opposed to the physician who's going to use the tech, as opposed to the administrator who's going to justify paying for the tech? So I definitely think that some of the terms that we use in medicine as far as, okay, well, what is an outcome? And there are many different types of outcomes, right? And what is a benefit as far as a financial benefit or something that's more financially competitive? That amount also, I think, gets lost in translation. Just people don't realize, like you said, it depends on the type of hospital, the location, all their other cost centers, how much of that financial incentive is actually incentivizing, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I think is funny that I hear said all the time that I really wonder if people know the definition of, and this is like obviously very controversial, but AI, like maybe let's actually define that correctly. I can't go through another conversation about that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a funny one that I see all the time. Or like care augmentation. Like, what does it mean to give somebody a device that's really actually going to help them care for a patient as opposed to just get in their way? So I think those are some of the big kind of like translational errors that I see. And maybe at the end of the day, like not really realizing who makes the final decisions a lot of time. But no, I think once we can teach innovators to speak the language of the hospital and the language of the healthcare system, it's only going to benefit them, right? Because then they can speak the language language of what the team is wanting, what the team is looking for. What kinds of translation errors have you seen?
Yeah, no, those were really, really good. I think there, even with people that work in healthcare, I think there's like layers to working in healthcare where it's like you can be like an absolute aficionado in all things direct patient care, but you have no idea how like the actual, economic mechanisms of a hospital works with reimbursement and service lines and inpatient versus outpatient versus like, you know what I mean? Like the whole continuum of care from an economic perspective. So like, I think that's one thing that I see as like maybe like a translational breakdown. Some of the things that you were hitting on for sure about who is really the person receiving this message in the audience and who has the final say and like what are the things that they actually care about. I think I don't know if this is a translation breakdown kind of, but one thing I've seen is like people don't understand that like the hospital has a lot of options and a finite amount of time and a finite amount of resources to do anything, right? That is like new products, new solutions, new services, whatever. So like you are competing against the status quo, what they're currently doing in the facility, but you are also competing against all of the other stuff that they could do, because if they have 2 hours of value analysis committee meetings a month, they're probably looking at 8 different things for 15 minutes, and like you're competing against all of that stuff too, right? So as frustrating as it may be, if you're like, hey, use my device, you're going to spend $500,000 to save $600K savings, like they may be getting pitched a revenue cycle management software that is going to save them $2 million and it costs $10,000 a month. So, and then their implementation resources may be tied up with that. So like, you're not always just competing against, what they're currently doing.
Similar products. Yeah. Or even similar products in the market. And then I think really in the same vein, you're even competing against what are the process changes that are going through, right? That's kind of like the unsexy side of medtech is how does this tech do a process change? And it's not, it doesn't get this cool video of like all the fancy doodads and get to take it to a trade show and like let people hold it and see it, but it can be just as effective. It can be save even more money for less cost implementation. So I think there's that aspect of it too, is you're competing against these kind of low cost systems change that hospitals are having to, for good reason, really consider strongly. And I think that's probably another aspect that gets lost, right? Is that like at what point, as an American healthcare system, we're building tech to solve these problems. And I mean more like administrative burden type problems or care patient flow or care delivery problems. And we're building tech and software to solve them. But really is the question, should we be asking the question, how do we get in this situation in the first place? And are we thinking too small, right? And so are innovators, just kind of solving the problems of today in 2025 that clinicians are dealing with or the nurses are dealing with? Or should we be thinking a bigger and look at a solution that kind of offers a new pathway, right? A new way of the hospital doing things. So I think that that's kind of an interesting combination as well. Can you get to a point where you're not only pitching a product, but pitching a new way of doing something? That comes with its own challenges, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I have a question about that, but first, I didn't hit on this, but the AI piece, like I almost try to say, like, I mean, I think like AI is like a clicky term right now, but like I literally will be like, yeah, use an LLM to do this, or use a reasoning model to do this, or a really robust RAG model or whatever. Like I try to be more specific about it, because one thing I've found too is that like, especially like, I think there's some like hype cycle. I'm not talking about the companies that have it as part of their offering and how they're communicating it, but like for the people that are like the users of like everyday AI, right? And if you don't really kind of understand the basics, there's LLMs, and then there's different models, and here's the providers, and then here's their models, and there's new ones, and then there's RAG, and then there's agentic, which has RAG, but it's doing its own stuff, and like prompt engineering. If you don't understand the basics of all that stuff, like you are really going to be left with an unsatisfying experience when you try to use AI, because you're only going to be scratching a little bit deep, and you're not getting the results, and you're not sparring with it, right? So like I try to like, when I'm talking about it with people, like not just say like, yeah, I use AI for this. It's like, well, I use this and this and this and this, and be specific about it. But the thing I was going to ask you, I totally agree. I feel like in a large respect, like people are solving the problems of today, and you definitely know more about kind of like the health tech and even digital tech or digital health side than I do. But like in my mind, like I feel like there is always this kind of like running up against it rate limiting factor for any of those digital health companies of like, hey, you're going to come in with a relatively point solution versus like the opposite of point solution being like a kind of an enterprise suite solution, whatever. And like you're going to have to integrate or play nice or whatever with like Epic or Cerner or whatever MS-DOS horrible looking office management software that they have. And so like they're almost kind of like rate limited to what they can like effectively implement in, because it is like such a huge task to say like, oh, we're going to rethink how you do X, which is going to have us touching 15 different databases and different interfaces and people doing it and all these flows. What do you see as kind of like the actual like rate limiting factor to people from a technical perspective, technology perspective, solving those big problems of the future versus just doing what they can to solve the problems of today?
Yeah, I think it's kind of two things. Number one, back to what we said at the beginning, it takes understanding how we currently deliver healthcare today. Absolutely. And understanding like what are actually the things that are annoying about how we do it, right? Not just like in a perfect world, how could it be? Okay, let's just start with exactly how we do it and exactly what stinks about it. Then I think then the transition is finding a partner that can see what the product can do, and then finding those key partnerships that either are willing to let you pilot in a small scale with the hopes to scale larger, or someone who's like, I'm so fed up with this situation, like we have just got to do a blank slate. So I don't think that there's any perfect, I really don't think that there's any magic bullet. And when I've talked with companies that have been really successful as far as like taking a digital health or a health tech product and really putting it to scale within the system, it depends on so many factors. And I don't think that there's really no perfect way to do it. But I think that you have to at least from the get-go show the value that you could add, right? And be able, I mean, like table stakes are, I have to at least integrate with what they currently do. Because I think finding a partner that's going to like take a chance on your product and completely redo what they've ever been doing is a little bit would be hard to find, right? That's kind of sounds like a unicorn. So I think it's a combination of like, can we implement in small scale, but be prepared as a company to go big for this group? Or, you know, does the product just not work that way? And our hospital systems, are they just too scared? And and is that wrong? You know, I think you could make an argument that we shouldn't be scared about doing those kinds of things, but I just don't think that's the world we live in.
Yeah. I mean, I think that part's probably like the bigger, to me, like impediment or whatever. It's like a fear of doing something big because if it doesn't work, you know, perfectly like they want it to, it could be massive disruption, right? Which like a necessarily ill-conceived fear that they might have. But I think like maybe kind of like the over-reliance on like hyper-centralized, non-redundant systems, right? I think that it's core because I really don't think like there is a lack of companies out there that could offer, you know, pretty groundbreaking solutions from like a digital perspective that could like really, but at the end of the day, I think it's like a risk tolerance. And I think it's like there's integration and implementation challenges that present risk. And then I don't know that the incentives are necessarily there because it's like, oh, okay, well, this could make this process or whatever better for everybody involved and probably prevent some bad outcomes from potentially happening. But like, how does that hit our bottom line in the next year? You know, people are coin operated, and I think institutions work on a similar like incentive type basis. I mean, like there was a big incentive years ago to move to electronic health records because like the federal government said you had to, you know what I mean? And then everybody did it.
Right.
But I definitely think like if hospitals said like, hey, Epic, hey, Cerner, we are going to demand that we have like more kind of ring fence sandbox environments where we can deploy and test, you know, things at a small scale. Like we demand that you help develop that. And maybe there's some of that exists. I don't know that if it does, I'm not aware of it. I think there are some pressures that could be applied to the incumbent players that are dominating digital ecosystem for hospitals and sites of care that I don't know what you think, if you think that could be helpful or if that exists.
I think that enough pressure, right? Put the people in the pressure cooker, you kind of get done what you want done. I wonder if that's why, at least in my experience, I've seen really integrative and successful deployment of some of these like unsexy but really effective health tech groups in these smaller organizations like ambulatory surgical centers or, you know, smaller private practice. And I wonder, like, I know you had Seamless MD on a few weeks ago or a few months ago. And I think about like stuff like that, right? Like these patient monitoring and patient instructions, patient care. And that's really what it's all about. I think even you and I talked about that, like with a family member with like a horrible ED experience. Like you leave and you're like, I don't even know what happened. I don't even know what to do. And so it's that kind of stuff, honestly. Like I really do enjoy the Medtech device, but I'm not a surgeon. I'm not a proceduralist. What I do a lot is discharge. What I do a lot is patient care, like transitioning out of the hospital. And so that's the stuff that really is interesting to me is how do I triage my patient maybe coming in? How do I keep them safe while they're here? That's why I love the inpatient monitoring side, you know, and then when they go home, you know, how do I make sure that I'm giving them the right information or helpful things and what are the touch touch points look like? And so I think that there's a huge space for integration of human touch points augmented by tech in that space. And I'd love to see that explode. So I think maybe that's why we're seeing, at least in my experience, seeing some of these smaller groups adopt those to a larger degree, maybe on like a risk tolerance kind of limiting factor type situation.
Yeah. So digging into that a little bit more, like, healthcare is resistant to change. Maybe a smaller group, smaller entity is going to be less resistant because it's easier. But like on that clinical workflow concept, like if you could redesign kind of that like technology adoption process, in hospitals from scratch, what would that look like in your mind? What's glaringly wrong or missing in that technology adoption process?
Do you mean inpatient use or anything?
I would say broadly, you take it hospital, wherever. I would say hospital because I feel like that's, that's kind of the big fish that I think is the worst at it right now.
I think it's a combination of allowing clinicians to explore what's out there. And I think for a long time, there's been this kind of like, not without reason or not without concern of like, is there conflict of interest, right? That conflict of interest and mitigating that risk is something to take really seriously. But the flip side of that is, have we as a hospital system or in healthcare in general kind of like insulated the clinician too much from what's next in tech or what could help their patients?
Yeah.
Have we allowed more of that to come like top down, like from administration down, telling clinicians or suggesting to clinicians what kind of initiatives would be better? And instead, take that more decentralized approach of saying, this is me, this is my department, this is my team, these are the problems we're having, right? I want to do X, Y, or Z better. Who can I talk with that might know what kind of products are on the market or are in development to solve XYZ problem? And can I do some kind of a small scale implementation to be able to see if that's going to work for us? So I really think that's the way. Now that's complex on a few levels. Number one is protected time. Are you familiar with this term?
Protected time.
As a clinician researcher, do I have time away from what I love, which is taking care of patients, but like protected time to be able to work on some of these side projects? And the answer is typically no. So I think that's hard. That kind of stifles innovation when you may have these ideas or kind of rumblings about what might work, but you're carrying a patient load, a very, very busy clinic schedule or a very busy surgical schedule. When are you supposed to find the time to do that? So I think if we can take this combination of like, okay, decentralize, we're going to let either people who are interested in process innovation or the actual tech itself or both in their own departments come up with some of these ideas of what are the problems we need solving, hopefully give them some kind of amount of time to use those creative brains to think about solutions and not just do it in the wee hours of the morning or the wee hours of the night or in between patients. And then we're going to give them the support that they need, right? And that I think can be a little bit more centralized, a support type system. But as an institution or as a hospital system, are we going to give these kind of, like decentralized clinical innovators help, right? Either with market research, if they're actually developing something, the R&D side, the engineering side, or if they're just looking to partner with someone that already has a product, those kind of relationships and guidance. So that's if I could make it better, I think that's what I would focus on.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I was like thinking of when you said protected time and explain it, like I was already thinking the hospital staffs to provide patient care, right? And they don't like typically budget like, oh, well, we're only going to staff these people till like 85 or 90% of their actual like workflow because we want them to be able to do all these other things. So that exists, right? Who are the people that are like really instrumental in the introduction of a new technology, implementation of a new technology going well, right? It may be, informatics, but it's a lot of times it's like the nurses, the unit managers, the director of nursing, like a surgeon, the perioperative services director or whatever, like all of those people, right? Those people are already working a full-time job and already doing full-time amounts of work for things. And so it's like, where does this time to really devote energy and resources and time, where does that time come from for them to devote it to like the implementation of new stuff? So if I was like rethinking from like almost like a first principles, how do we redesign this like technology adoption process? I would like literally hire, and it could be a team, maybe there's a nurse and a PA, and a surgeon or whatever, but all they do is implementation. They're just the implementation team. So whether you're doing a trial evaluation or a pilot or bringing in a new technology or whatever, that's all they spend their time on, right? And they're working with the surgeons and they're kind of like the liaison between those actual frontline direct patient care people that are using this technology, right? And then the company on the outside, because it is so cost prohibitive when a hospital has such little available time and energy to help you implement your thing. Like I've seen like companies, they have to like park someone 24/7 at the hospital to just do basic stuff, to like go around around the units and be like, hey, we implemented this, you should be using it, right? So anyways, I think if a hospital is going to spend, $250,000 on a new solution to implement it, it's crazy to me that they're like, oh, well, we're not willing to hire anyone that's chiefly charged with seeing that implementation be successful. But I think those positions would be awesome. I think they would help so many things, and these technologies like not just get adopted, but get adopted and implemented the right way and like cut down that like switching cost. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you are doing it on clinician mindset approach, whether that's the nurse, the PA, the doctor, the surgeon, whoever, and also someone who's really in the hospital system already, they understand the pain points of that specific institution, how beneficial that would be for companies, right? Those like kind of boots on the ground. And then I'm already thinking of like, wow, I wonder how much that would cut your clinical study costs, right? If you're already kind of managing that, right? Clinical coordinators are unbelievably expensive, and they're wonderful. I love my clinical coordinators. Telly, if you watch this, love you. Like I think you guys are great, but it's really, really hard. It's really expensive. And I'm just already thinking like, wow, what a resource if institutions would be able to, or saw the value in like shifting some of those costs to be able to fund a person who could help run, these kinds of things. And then I think, you just know the temperature of the room. It's like, it's a go, it's a no, and then you move on to the next thing. Something we haven't touched on, which I will just share in the group that I work with is really fantastic. And we're really lucky to have a lot of similar projects that we've kind of mentioned and similar roles that we've talked about. And as far as these kind of like implementers, groups, people on the ground, people that know the system, more kind of process innovation and change. The only thing I always like to keep people abreast of and like remind them of is trialing new thing after new thing after new thing for the clinician can get exhausting, right? Yeah. And I think that's only something that I really don't hear people talking about. And I think that sometimes that's just the growing pains of change though, right? But that it can be hard if you're either trying to implement a tech and you're approaching a group and they're like, listen, we tried something similar, or we tried this X, Y, or Z thing 6 months ago and everyone hated it and it just was a burnout. That just might be a partner that's not quite ready. You know what I mean? And I think that just kind of giving that feedback to innovators, like if you're trying to work with a group that has had a bad experience with like a rollout before, it's almost like a bad breakup. You got to kind of take that like emotional baggage into account, like they might not be ready for courtship yet because all those people got burned. And it was tough. So I think that's something that people just don't think about, is what was this division or this group's last experience with tech rollout, and how might that affect, my pilot or my rollout going forward?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's also like kind of an authority issue. I feel like sometimes if you're like sales rep or implementation rep from X company coming in and being like, hey guys, like you should do this, make sure you do this or whatever. They're like, yeah, you're another rep in my mind. Get out of here. I don't care. But like somebody that is like given authority by kind of the powers that be at that institution coming in and being like, hey guys, like this is what we expect you guys to do. This is coming from top brass, whatever. That is so much different. And you could argue like, yeah, the PI or kind of the champion, right, may to a degree have that authority, but I feel like if coming from like an implementation specialist with that authority would be way more, because you're kind of having to solve for this issue of like, sometimes a lot of the people that are tasked with implementing and using the solution like are not directly feeling any of the benefits. So like in their mind, it's like, why am I doing this? Why would I expend energy and time and like disrupt my current workflow of what I was doing to do this thing that I get zero benefit of, like directly or financially? You know what I mean?
Right. What I was going to say was that, to your point on like, how do we get buy-in? That's why I think this like decentralized approach of how are we using the people who may not think of themselves as clinician innovators? How are we activating them and getting them excited about the trial or getting them excited about the rollout? And then like, you almost don't need, you can still have this top-down implementer, but I think that comes across a lot clearer and a lot more organically when you kind of have multiple stakeholders from the actual team engaged, at least in some way, in whatever rollout you're attempting or working through. You know what I mean? So I think that can be super powerful as well. It's not something that I've seen done a whole lot, but I hope that that's changing.
Yeah, 100%. So I want to ask about kind of this like concept of like value beyond ROI, right? Like value being more than ROI. A lot of startups will lead with ROI when they're pitching to like a hospital or health system? I know you believe that kind of value really extends beyond just like the ROI. So like what metrics in your mind should innovators actually be focusing on that they're currently missing?
Yeah, absolutely. ROI, I think, gets way more airtime than it really should. I really think, because again, when you look at a hospital budget, a lot of the, at least what I've seen, a lot of the ROI claims or ROI ideal situations that these innovators are coming with is like this chump change. It just is, and that I think is hard for people to hear, but the reality is that it's very expensive to run a hospital every day. So if you're going to do something to the bottom line that is meaningful, I mean, that takes a unreal amount of change and unreal amount of cash flow, like just numbers, like it's math. So I think kind of pivoting away from, ROI is still important. People are still going to ask about it. It still is valuable, but also touching on the ROI aspects or the value aspects that really resonate with people. And that's, how does this improve the current workflow? How does this make it easier for the user? How does this improve patient experience? Which patient experience metrics, surveys, those are things that people really care about. Those are things that hospitals really care about. How does this improve outcomes? And looking beyond, morbidity and mortality, how does this move the needle on measurable patient outcomes, whether it's readmissions, whether it's infection rate, where we look at a lot, there's coming down the pipeline as far as like when we talk about CMS and what hospitals are going to be evaluated for as far as inappropriate or poor patient outcomes, those are changing. Mm-hmm. And I think the more the innovators can kind of see it through that lens of what do systems care about, they'll only benefit from that. And yeah, so this whole value, ROI, it's so much bigger than just cash flow.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because, the whole value analysis committee thing, and I've dealt with this like firsthand and then talked to a lot of people that dealt with it firsthand, but it's like they seem to be very obsessed with, like what is the economic ROI? Like this, how is this going to like increase profit, drive additional revenue, right, in some way, shape, or form. And it does seem to be a focus with them. And it, just like we were talking about earlier, different health systems and different hospitals like may have different focuses on it. What you said is kind of striking to me. It's like, yeah, like if you come in and say like, hey, you've got a medium-sized hospital here in, somewhere in Ohio, right? Like we're going to save you $100,000 a year by implementing our solution. That hospital's annual revenue is probably like $1 billion. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, yeah, like, I mean, $100,000 is not a small amount of money. And maybe it's like, hey, spend $60K to save $100K. So how there seems to be this, like, you can't make big changes to your bottom line without making, like, if you score 12 runs in a baseball game, you didn't hit 12 home runs, right? It was a bunch of singles, a bunch of doubles, some good base running, right? Like, so like, how do you kind of square that up with, yes, it's peanuts in the grand scheme of things, but like those peanuts add up and that's ultimately what you have to do to improve care.
Yeah. And maybe this brings it back like to that more philosophical question of like, are we just solving like these small leaks in the bottom of the boat, or are we like taking the boat out of the water and like totally redoing the whole thing? So are we just kind of filling these gaps in care or these gaps in, patient flow, or are we really being bold in how we're thinking about healthcare delivery in the US? And I think it will really take a transition to that mindset to develop and deliver tech that's actually going to change those kinds of like monetary ROI, right? But again, when we talk about what gets approved through like a value analysis committee versus what gets successfully implemented, I think that's, potentially where people go awry. What a value analysis committee wants to hear versus what your end user is actually going to stick with and why they're going to stick with your tech is completely different. And you're crazy if you aren't thinking of both, right? Because your nurse who's using your product, he or she was not on the value analysis committee. They don't give two hoots about what they said, but does that tech make their life easier? And does that tech bring, a better care to the patient?
Yeah. I've got a question, and this may for anybody that works in value analysis out there that's listening to this, like, please close your ears. And I'm not talking about you, but I feel like if you've been doing this long enough and if you've like interacted with enough value analysis committee people, every position, they come in many different shapes and sizes, but I have the interactions with value analysis committee people, teams, whatever. And like any conversation about we plug in the hole in the boat, or are we like lifting the boat out and making bigger changes and all that stuff? Like, it seems like sometimes they are like, I'm here to just clock in and clock out and do my job. Is it on the GPO contract? No, get on the contract. Did the surgeon ask for it? We're not going to invite the surgeon into the meeting. We're just going to look at your, bottom line ROI thing. And I don't know if that's been your experience to a degree, because sometimes it feels like, how did these people get to this position? And like, what is their real modus operandi, right? Like, are these people that are like really passionate about evaluating innovative new technologies? Or was this someone that the next promotion out of a supply chain management position was to do this thing now? And they are doing it, and they are working 40 hours a week.
Yeah, I really do not know the answer to that question. What I think though is interesting is it kind of brings it back though to this protected time, of like, God, we're all so busy. Do you ever feel, especially, I don't know, like I'm a parent, I have young kids. Sometimes I'm just clocking in and clocking out. Like sometimes I'm just like, keep everyone alive, get everyone fed, like let everyone sleep for some amount of time tonight. And how often like are we allowing ourselves to stop and think big picture? And I think that when we kind of get stuck in the rat race, right, we're just like solving today's problems, but we're not thinking of the system as a whole. And I really do equate that to healthcare in general. And I'm sure business in a lot of ways as well. But in healthcare, right, it's like I have to see the next patient. I have to write the next order, right? I have to carry out the next order. I have to get that new shipment, right? If I'm in supply chain, I've got to check on these things. And we're so busy doing our tasks, which have importance, right? People's lives are at stake really here. And how often are we given that space, right, in the clinical realm to stop, take a step back and look at the picture as a whole? And we're allowing, maybe the people that manage us to be able to do that, we think, right? But they're actually doing the same thing. They have fires to put out every day, right? And so I think that's, something really, really interesting that kind of leads back to the value analysis committee question is how much are we allowing our individual employees to think big picture on how we can make the system better? And I don't know of any other way to do that than giving people the time and space to have those thoughts and those conversations.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm a big believer in like a people or products of their environment, like very, very much so, like probably as much as you can believe that, you know what I mean? And so like, I think whenever I'm talking about these, kind of value analysis people, I'm really not disparaging them. I'm kind of disparaging the system and like, how they got there in terms of what, like how the hospital recruits for this position. And then like the incentive structure of the position itself, right? Like, are they incentivized to say no to more things? Are they incentivized somehow, right? Are they aware of success metrics? Are they incentivized to like drive these specific outcomes, in a way that is like directly beneficial to them, right? If they take a risk on implementing something that does have like a really good chance at like you said, solving a bigger problem, if they take the risk on that and it's successful, are they rewarded for that, right? Or is there only downside for them in their position to doing that? So they're going to just like opt to do it less and less and almost none, right? So I really think talking about taking the boat out of the water, right? Like I think this is one of those things of like, how is value and ROI defined in terms of like the people that are evaluating it for the hospital and then the incentive structure for them to do behavior A or behavior B, right? So unsexy tech, that's the next thing I want to ask about. So I know you've advocated that for focusing on kind of the unsexy side of healthcare and health tech. We already talked about like, there's a lot of like hype around like flashy AI stuff, as well as some like, robotic stuff, this, that, and the other, and augmented reality, right? So from like an innovator perspective, like how do you convince investors, and even founders, right, that things like patient chart workflow and things like that, right, that are maybe less sexy, still deserve attention and are still like viable and investable businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh. And again, like, I think it just brings it right back to talk to someone who's taking care of patients right now. Like if you tell them, hey, I have a way, or I have a tech, I have a new workflow that I can make your notation easier, your notation more sound, less mitigating risk with that, or what have you, like people would die for that, right? You're going to have like a line out the door if you start saying those kinds of things. And we are seeing in wide scale adoption of those kinds of models, right? For note taking and note building, which is wonderful. And I think that it's those kinds of things that you hear it and you're like, oh, wow, a language model that hears me and that builds a whole note based on my patient encounter. That is so incredible. And yes, it is, but it's literally just, it's making a note. Like that's like the least sexy part of healthcare, right? Is notation and documentation. So I think that's a great great example of like, yeah, that note and thinking through the note. There's portions of the note taking and the documentation that are not neither enjoyable and they can be time consuming. And I think, the other things like patient instructions, patient education, circling back with patients, checking in on them after discharge, these kinds of things, that does not sound exciting. A neurosurgical robot sounds way more cool, but how many patients leave the hospital and still don't fully understand, what to do next? And I think in a lot of ways, you have clinicians that are out there working really, really hard to avoid those situations, right? But what have we done to the system to really convolute it, right? So where is the health tech that can just simplify that process and make that really seamless or make that really clear, whether that's in documentation, discharge information, all those things. So yeah, I think the carrot, I really do believe the carrot for companies that are like, no, I want to go with a shiny robot, or the investors that would prefer the robot. I think it's, again, it's back to what's the ROI on that, right? What would it cost a health system to implement something like that if you can show measurable better patient outcomes? That might be significant, right?
Yeah.
Or what is the measurable outcome as far as patient experience? How would your patient experience change? Does your patient experience change a whole lot with the new robot, or does it change with a new augmented way to discharge people that gives them a better understanding of what their next steps are? So I think those, kind of going back to that, like, value is more than ROI question and answer is probably the carrot to give to the investors and the founders that want the robot and don't want the unsexy things.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. The like two examples of some like unsexy stuff that's just like doing really, really well, like Seamless MD, you know what I mean? It's like, pre-op patient instructions, right? So it's like, yeah, that's not sexy. Like what is, and it's like, well, if you're having to cancel 6% of your surgeries because people forget that they're not supposed to eat or drink anything that morning, or to stop their blood thinner medications, right? Like that's a pretty significant disruption to your throughput and ROI. And like, what is that worth to you, on an annual basis if you're doing, 5,000 surgeries, right? So I think that's one example. And then there's another example, a company out of Little Rock that I know that they will kind of plug into your primary care type clinic setting. And I think they work with hospitals too. I honestly need to check up on them. Mike Steely is like my guy there, but they'll like plug in and basically be like, hey, like we can help you like reconcile like missed billing, coding and billing where you didn't bill this and you should have, right? You're like leaving money on the table from like an insurance coding and billing perspective, like super unsexy, right? But if you're a clinic doing 10 million a year and you're missing, 2 to 5% of like what you could be of like care that you did that you're not getting compensated for, basically, like it's a big deal, right? Like it's a big deal. So like there's loads of like unsexy things like that. And to the point too, Natalie, like now with all of like the low code and no code, like Cursor, Windsurf, Bolt, Lovable, all the LLMs that can help code, the cost to prototype and the cost to kind of like launch these types of solutions, even ones that are like heavily leveraging an LLM, has like never been smaller. And you really don't even have to go the VC route, right? For a lot of these solutions these days. And if you're building a digital health company and you think you need to raise 5 million to like get it to market or launch or whatever, I would like seriously question that. Like go back to the drawing board. Like, can you do this like way cheaper, get 3 customers, and then try to scale with revenue instead of scaling with VC dollars? That would be my take. So want to kind of end on this. I just want to be respectful of your time. We could talk for like days and days and days. I know we could. So, electronic health records, I think it like remains kind of like the bane of a lot of clinicians' existence, like to the point where like I remember in Little Rock, they were switching from Cerner or Epic to Cerner or something like that. And there were a bunch of physicians that were like, if you make this switch, I'm going to leave. I refuse. So if you had the power to force, the 3 biggest EHR companies to make one change tomorrow, what would you demand?
Yeah, I absolutely would demand that our patient discharge workflow would be clearer for patients, right? Increase information about what the expectations are at discharge, or, what recommendations we have, a more robust way of giving really evidence-guided stuff and having that be really easy for clinicians to just drag and drop and make sure that patients know what the best recommendations, what the guidelines are for their various conditions, or what we treated them for at the hospital. My other concern, Spencer, and my thoughts on this are, I absolutely would love to see these big EHR systems work more on what does network downtime look like. So in the hospital, basically what that means is your EHR EHR goes down for whatever reason, but making sure that our hospitals and our clinicians are prepared for when that, does and will happen. So if I could wave a magic wand, those would be my two updates that I would see tomorrow.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Yeah, while you were saying the first one on the discharge instructions, it just reminded me of a conversation I was having with Josh Liu from Seamless MD about the percent of patients that have smartphones. How do we build systems for, only for kind of the 10% and then force the other 90% to operate off that kind of low tech, solution? Or do we have multiple options for people depending on kind of like their level of, tech savviness, if you will? But I was thinking in my head of I run my life off of my Google Calendar. You know what I mean? And some people do it off their iCal or what have you. And we've all registered for an event, and what do you get? You get an email and it's add it to your calendar or whatever. So I would love to see discharge instructions where it's scan this QR code to add these things to your calendar. And it's every morning it's these are the it's a little event, and it's take these medications, you know what I mean? And then at 1 week, it's here's what you should be expecting. And it's just a little event. You click on it and it's got the stuff for you in there, but kind of a calendar based deal that has medication reminders and what to expect reminders, and even hey, call this number to schedule a follow-up. And it's just already in your calendar, right? Because I would imagine that a lot of the people that discharge from the hospital operate off of some form of digital calendar, whether it's Outlook, iCal, or Google Calendar. It's just a low-hanging fruit in my mind. Just one example, you know what I mean? But yeah,
no, I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, I've used Cerner, I've used Epic. They are so frustrating. And it's funny, my wife I won't say the health system she works for, but she works on the Epic team for a health system. She does build outs and integration. So I might talk to her about some of these ideas that you have.
100%. Yeah, I think it's really, it gets tricky though when you're what we talked about earlier, finite resources, right? And so are we operating in a system, even big scale system, big S system? Are we operating in a US healthcare system where we're really helping everybody elevate whatever they got going on with their EHR? Or are we forcing people to piecemeal, different solutions that work? And again, it's kind of plugging the holes at the bottom of the boat versus making sure that the whole boat actually makes sense for the type of water we're trying to even navigate through. And I think that's where a lot of people find frustration. And I definitely am one of them, where it just feels you're solving today's problems rather than full system, big circle, whatever.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I mean, the decentralized point, right? If you have one massive centralized system and you have any downtime, right? The whole thing's down, right? It's not these we're going to do rolling downtime in stages, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, this is really interesting. Final point I'll make, and then I'm going to kind of kick it back to you to help us close here. But you hear startups and business leaders a lot talk about working in the business or working on the business. And it doesn't feel healthcare, from the people that work in the hospital, right? It seems like they're all working in the business, and there's very few people that are working on the business with a clinical mindset of how do we really improve these things? How do we maximize value? What's the new stuff out there? How should we be fixing the boat, and not just kind of eyes up, working in the business, so busy we don't even know what's going on. But yeah, working in the business, on the business, I think there's a bit of that is needed for hospitals and the people in healthcare. So I'll finish off with this. Any parting words of wisdom, or any final thoughts, kind of burning statements you want to get out there? The floor is yours, and then I'll say you can end with that. Anything that you'd like to plug?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think my message to anyone who's out there who is either a clinician looking to innovate, your current system, keep talking, right? Keep using your voice, keep advocating for the change that you want to see, just locally. Start small, start within your department. Really be what we've been saying, that decentralized approach to innovation and simple system process change really can go a long way. And if then you're more interested in the device implementation or the tech implementation, if you're a founder and you're interested in building a product that's actually going to help people and going to, be purchased by your ideal customer, then I think the key there is talking to clinicians, understanding that workflow. How can I build a product, first of all? Then how can I talk about a product in the way that my future customer, my future patients are really going to resonate with them? And you won't be able to do that successfully unless you don't fully understand, how healthcare is delivered today.
Yep. Amen. That was so good. Natalie Freels, PA, CEO of InsightHealth Consulting. I can't thank you enough for being on the pod. This was super, super, super fun. And I know we could have talked for like 8 more hours. So we're going to have to get you back on at some point to just like do like a round 2 and keep the conversation going. But like, Natalie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Spencer.
Yep. And thanks for everybody for tuning in. If you stuck around for the whole episode, and hope you have a great rest of your week. Take care. Thank you.